She was silenced, betrayed, and left behind. Everyone thought her chapter was over, erased, forgotten. But then, the music hit, and when that first note echoed through the arena, the crowd didn't cheer. They erupted. That was the moment WWE learned something they should have never forgotten. You can't bury true greatness. The machine is a hungry thing. It demands consistency. It feeds on predictability. Every week, the same trucks roll into a new city, the same steel cage is erected, and the same faces cycle through the curtain, playing their part in a grand, violent opera. Backstage is a city unto itself, a maze of cables, roadie cases, and hushed conversations under the dim glow of production lights. It's a world that runs on cues and muscle memory. In this world, Drew McIntyre was a paragon of its design. A warrior carved from granite and ambition, his focus absolute. He moved through the halls with a purpose that parted the crowds of technicians and talent alike. He was the present and the future. Then there was Randy Orton. Orton was the past, a living monument to an era of pure, uncut aggression. He wasn't just part of the machine, he was one of its original gleaming patents. But 2 decades is a long time to be anything, even a legend. He'd walk those same halls, a ghost in plain sight. His presence felt more than seen. He was respected, feared, but kept at a distance. The machine protected its investments. And somewhere in its code, in the archives of its history, was a corrupted file. A name that was never spoken. A face that was never shown in video packages. She was the ghost in the machine, an absence so profound it had its own gravity. Everyone knew the void was there, but they'd all learned to walk around it. They called it professionalism. They called it moving on. But it was fear. Fear of a memory that could still crash the entire system. Being the Viper for 20 years is a slow poison. At first, the character is armor. It protects the man inside from the roar of the crowd, the coldness of the business, the solitude of the road. But after 1,000 matches, 100 betrayals, the armor starts to fuse to the skin. The man inside forgets where he ends and the persona begins. For Randy Orton, the performance had become second nature. The cold, predatory stare wasn't an act. It was a reflex. The deliberate serpentine walk wasn't a choice. It was how he moved through the world. But lately, in the quiet moments, something else would surface. Standing before a mirror in the sterile, anonymous space of the locker room, he'd see it. A flicker of exhaustion in his own eyes. A weariness that the character wasn't meant to have. The Viper doesn't get tired. The apex predator doesn't feel the weight of his own legend. But the man did. He carried the ghosts of every RKO, every championship won and lost, every friendship fractured for the sake of a storyline. The heaviest ghost, though, was the one he never spoke of. The one connected to a past he'd helped bury. It was the source of his character's most authentic cruelty, a well of real pain he'd learned to draw from. He'd perfected the art of turning that pain into a performance, a mythology. But the mythology was starting to crack. The razor-thin line between Randy Orton and the Viper was beginning to dissolve, not into a perfect fusion, but into a quiet, simmering crisis. He was trapped inside the legend he built, and he was starting to forget the way out. It was a Tuesday in Cleveland. The air inside the arena was thick with the smell of popcorn and anticipation. It was just another Monday Night Raw, a routine stop on the endless tour. The kind of night that usually blurs into 100 others. Drew McIntyre stood in the center of the ring, bathed in the sharp, artificial daylight of a dozen spotlights. He was in his element, the microphone held tight in his fist, his voice a low growl that commanded the attention of 15,000 people. He spoke of honor, of battle, of the championship that was his destiny. The words were powerful, practiced, perfect for the role he was born to play. The crowd responded on cue, their chants a rhythmic, predictable pulse that drove the show forward. It was business as usual. The machine was running perfectly. And then, a glitch. For a single frame, the massive Titantron above him flickered, showing not his face, but a spray of digital static. A high-pitched whine cut through the arena's sound system, a feedback squeal that made people wince. A technical error, nothing more. The production truck would fix it. But then the whine softened, morphed, and settled into a single, haunting musical note. A piano key. It was a sound that belonged nowhere near the thunderous, guitar-driven world of WWE. It was an echo from a forgotten place. And in that one hanging note, the entire rhythm of the show broke. The crowd's chants faltered, their collective breath held in a moment of shared, sudden confusion. Something was wrong. Something was different. Then the first bar of music followed the note. It wasn't a rock anthem. It wasn't hip-hop. It was a mournful, cinematic melody that washed over the arena like a forgotten memory. And the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They gasped. A sound of 15,000 people suddenly remembering something they were told to forget. It started as a murmur in the front rows. A name, whispered in disbelief. Then the murmur grew into a roar. Not a pop for a returning hero, but an eruption of pure, unadulterated shock. Backstage, the machine ground to a halt. Headsets crackled with panicked, useless questions. Producers stared, frozen, at their monitors. Veterans who had been walking through the corridor stopped dead in their tracks, their faces paling. This wasn't on the schedule. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't possible. In a small, dark room away from the chaos of guerrilla position, Randy Orton watched it all on a small screen. For the first time in a decade, his composure shattered. The mask of the Viper didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His jaw went slack. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wide with something no one had ever seen in them before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It looked, for just one terrifying second, like the purest form of dread. The ghost had just walked out of the machine, and he knew it was coming for him. She emerged from the tunnel, and the wall of sound from the crowd seemed to bend around her. She wasn't wearing ring gear. There was no pyro, no grand theatrics. She simply walked, and her presence alone was enough to hijack reality. The narrative of the entire show, of Drew's championship quest, of everything that was supposed to matter, evaporated in the time it took for her to walk down the ramp. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the ring. In that moment, Drew McIntyre, the 6'5" Scottish warrior, looked completely and utterly powerless. The microphone in his hand suddenly felt like a useless prop. The script he'd memorized, the insults he'd prepared, the entire framework of his performance, it was all gone, erased by a ghost he'd only heard stories about. The camera zoomed in on his face, and for the first time, the world saw the flicker of doubt. It wasn't the strategic doubt of a wrestler wondering what move comes next. It was the profound, human doubt of a man who has lost control of his own story. He was an intruder in a moment that was not his. The silence stretched between them, a heavy, unscripted void filled only by the roar of the crowd chanting her name. She stopped at the foot of the ring, never breaking her gaze. She didn't need a microphone. She didn't need to say a word. Her return was the statement. And in her silence, she had taken everything from him. The moment she disappeared back through the curtain, the backstage area became a vacuum of sound. The usual chaotic energy of a live show, the shouting, the hurried footsteps, the crackle of radios, died instantly. Everyone, from the catering staff to the top executives, stood frozen, their eyes locked on the entrance. They created a wide path for her, a corridor of silent, stunned respect. It was the kind of hush reserved for tragedy or triumph, and no one knew which this was. She walked through the sea of bodies as if they weren't there, her purpose clear. Her path ended where Randy Orton stood, leaning against a cold, cinder-block wall, away from the prying eyes at the monitors. He had moved there instinctively, a predator seeking shadows. He had put the mask back on, but the fit was wrong. The coldness in his eyes was brittle now, a defense mechanism working overtime. They stood less than 5 feet apart, and the air between them was electric with unspoken history. There were no cameras, no audience, just two people and the weight of a decade of silence. And that's when it happened. The second, his controlled, manufactured anger as the Viper turned into something real. It wasn't loud. It was a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening in his jaw. It was a raw, protective instinct. For her, or for himself, it was impossible to tell. The mask slipped again, not with shock this time, but with the terrifying clarity of a buried truth clawing its way to the surface. The unscripted moment backstage echoed longer and louder than her music ever did. In the hours that followed, the locker room fractured along invisible lines. The younger talent, those who came up in a sanitized system, were lost. They huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones, asking questions the veterans refused to answer. To them, she was a myth, a cautionary tale whispered by old trainers. To see her in the flesh was like watching a character walk out of a history book and set the library on fire. The veterans were different. They were silent. They avoided eye contact, retreating into their own private spaces. They remembered. They remembered the politics, the betrayal, and the corporate decision to erase her chapter. Her return wasn't a comeback. It was an indictment. It forced them to look at the machine they served and acknowledge the bodies it had buried to keep its gears turning. This is the truth about legends. They don't just carry the weight of their own championships and accolades, they carry the pain of those who were sacrificed along the way. Randy Orton, more than anyone, was a living archive of that pain. The applause he received every night was built on a foundation of moments the company wanted you to forget. Her return ripped up that foundation. It proved that history is not a line. It's a circle, and a ghost, if left to wander long enough, will always find its way home. Drew McIntyre felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had dedicated his life to this. He had been anointed, chosen as the next standard bearer. He followed the rules, he hit his marks, he delivered the promos they wrote for him. He had earned his spot. Now, in the span of 3 minutes, he had been rendered irrelevant. A supporting actor in a story he didn't understand. His frustration was not that of a heel whose plans were foiled or a face who was wronged. It was the cold, quiet rage of a master craftsman whose entire project had been contaminated by an unknown element. He found a lead producer in the chaos, his voice low and tight, demanding an explanation. What he got in return was a masterclass in corporate deflection. It's a fluid situation. We're playing it by ear. Trust the process. There was no process. Control had been an illusion. This one unscripted moment revealed the truth of the business. Even the king on the chessboard is still just a piece. He was a champion in waiting, a titan of a man. Yet his destiny was not in his hands. It had been hijacked by a memory, a ghost from a past that had nothing to do with him. He was trapped between the performance the world expected and a reality that was unfolding live, without a script, without a safety net. And for a man whose entire career was built on strength and certainty, the feeling of powerlessness was a poison far deadlier than any Claymore kick. By the end of the 3rd hour, Randy Orton's music hit. It was his scheduled time for the main event promo. He walked his deliberate walk, he posed on the turnbuckles, he took the microphone. He did everything the machine required of him. But when the lights settled and the arena fell quiet, the words wouldn't come. The script felt alien in his mind. He stood there, in the center of the ring, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. The crowd was buzzing, expecting the cool, venomous threats of the Viper. Instead, they got the crippling hesitation of a man. He finally lowered the mic just for a moment and looked down at the mat. When he lifted his head, the character was gone. For 20 years, he started, his voice rough, stripped of its usual cadence. I've been this thing, this idea, and you're told what to do, who to be, who to forget. He never said her name. He didn't have to. The air crackled with it. "They build you up," he continued, his voice cracking just once, "and to do it, they have to tear someone else down. They write the checks, they write the history, but they don't get to write the truth." It wasn't a promo. It was a confession, broadcast live to the world. It was the single most dangerous and real thing that had happened in that ring in years. He was no longer the apex predator. He was a man breaking protocol, breaking character, and breaking the fourth wall of his own life, all for a ghost that the world was finally seeing again. As Orton let the microphone fall from his hand, the sound of it hitting the canvas echoed with a shocking finality. The show ended not with an explosion, but with a deafening, human silence. The ripples of that night would be felt for years, studied and dissected as the moment the performance finally buckled under the weight of reality. The story was never about a championship. It wasn't about a new feud or a triumphant return. It was about the pressure that builds for decades behind the curtain, in the quiet locker rooms and the lonely hotel suites. It was about the cost of keeping a legend alive, of wearing a mask for so long that you forget the face underneath. Her return wasn't a plot point. It was a reckoning, a single, unscripted moment that forced an entire universe to confront the pain it had so carefully buried. It was the night a man known as the Viper finally shed his skin and showed the scars beneath. Maybe this wasn't about victory or revenge. Maybe it was just about being seen, being real, because sometimes even legends break, and when the mask cracks, we finally see the human underneath.